Right, what I wanted to do is produce a video that covers or a lot of the topics in production, finance and the external business environment. I'm going to talk through this over maybe 20 minutes, so this will probably bore you to tears, but it might be just a different way to tackle some of your revision from going through past exam papers and looking at your revision guides, etc. It is not, I repeat, it is not a list of every single topic that you have to look at. It's just me looking at the topic headings and talking off the top of my head about some of the key elements of each topic. Clearly, I tackled production and I also tackled external business environment, and then Mr. Pears tackled finance. All of the topics that we've discussed sort of roughly since Christmas have to be linked with the case study. I'm going to do separate videos that we'll use in class, and you can also use as a revision guide if you can handle my Yorkshire tones. But everything we talk about must be linked to that. You must have loads of quotes, etc., ready to use in the exam. So before we go on, I must stress this is not every topic you need to look at. It's just the ones that I feel are really key during your revision, might be worth looking at and listening to just before the exam. So the first one I'm going to look at, and these numbers I'm going to use in the case study when I go through the case study. First thing I'm going to look at is number 1 and job. So job production produces often very high quality goods because of the fact that you've got high skilled labour, often handmade or hand sewn if we're talking about cushions, and it will demand a higher price. Have to often train your staff more, pay them higher wages, etc. Next one, batch. So batch production is when you might do a batch of blue cushions, then a batch of red cushions. You might change the detailing on the cushions, etc. Things like that. You can have to reset the machinery, often is machinery led. So it makes more, so the unit cost does come down compared to job. However, when you compare it to flow, it's more expensive, but it brings variety, and then with variety, you've got customers have a better choice, etc. Then look at flow. Flow production is when you, like Coca-Cola for example, you make thousands and thousands, millions and millions of one type of item. It's often seen as a little bit more lower quality. Unit cost is really low, so you have to sell a high volume of them, high number of them. If the unit cost is low, quite often the selling price is low as well because there's nothing new, unique about it. So if they were going to use flow production, then they'd have to sell at a huge number of outlets globally. Lower selling price, for example, I think it's down at £15, isn't it, would probably be linked to flow production. Now, next real section is number 2, and you're looking at increasing efficiency. So the ways that you would increase efficiency, you would look at things like TQM, so total quality management, and that's the important phrase is it's a culture. Everybody connected to the business has to focus on quality, right from the planning and design stage, logistics, through to the manufacturing, all the management, and then delivery and links with suppliers, etc. So it's a culture that takes a long time to embed in a new business. You'd also look at lean production. Lean production produces less waste. Less waste is obviously good because you're not throwing away sort of the cuttings from each cushion. With less waste, it again reduces your impact on the environment and your unit costs. Then this topic wants you to look at costs. So we start off with fixed costs. So fixed costs are costs that don't change in relation to output. So it doesn't matter how many produce, these particular costs are going to stay the same. Often things like insurance, your mortgage payments, things like that. You've then got variable costs. Variable costs are costs that change in relation to how many you produce, linked to your output. So certainly it'd be raw materials for this cushion making company. Hey, can you hear Molly crying? Yeah, I better step in. Hold on, I'll have to pause the video. Right, back after a little crying session from the new arrival in my family. So next we'll look at average costs. So average costs is when you take the total cost and you divide them by the number that you produce. It produces a unit cost, so how much it's costing the company to produce one cushion. And that's really important, because then when you have the selling price as well, you can see how much contribution you're making towards the fixed cost every time you sell one. You obviously need to understand the total cost, all the costs that go in to making the actual goods. Now it's getting a little bit cramped at the bottom. Two more things to look at. So economies of scale is the next one you probably have to look at. Now, the larger the company, it's the advantages of being a large company. So you can order in bulk. You can have international suppliers. You can have distribution points around the country or even further afield. So you can reach a larger target audience. You can attract better employees. You can get your hands on finance that little bit easier, because the banks feel that you're that little bit more reliable and they don't see you as a risk quite so much. However, there are disadvantages of being a large company, so diseconomies of scale. And that often is to do with staff. So the bigger you get, communication becomes an issue between the various manufacturing sites. Maybe you've got sites in different parts of the world. So people, it tends to become difficult to track and monitor how operations are moving forward, or maybe not moving forward in different countries, because there's language barriers, there's time differences, etc. So the bigger you get, sometimes there's some problems in terms of organisation. The last sort of major area they want to look at here is, and I'm going to have to go up top, is break even. Handwriting's horrendous. For break even, you need to make sure that you know the formula, which we know is fixed costs divided by, so we'll put this up here actually, fixed costs divided by selling price minus variable costs per unit. So if you have the figures, which you will be able to get from the case study, you must be able to pump them into that particular formula. And actually on the day of the exam they might change some of those figures, so you have to be comfortable with that formula and be able to manipulate it. Break even is the number of cushions in this case that a company will have to sell, so they don't actually make a loss or a profit. It's used in businesses to set targets. If, for example, the break-even point is, just off the top of my head, 1,000 and they make 2,000, then they've got a margin of safety of 1,000 because they're making 1,000 more than they need to. The formula in general is not very flexible, so in the real business environment, it's got its limitations. For example, fixed costs quite often aren't fixed costs. That the selling price for the cushions varies, and the unit cost the variable cost per unit will change regularly because of different deals that the company might be able to get from suppliers. So in actual fact, that formula has got its problems, and you need to be able to research those and talk about them. Right, if you've stuck with the video and you've managed to hang in there with my very monotone Yorkshire voice, the next thing we're going to look at is sources of finance and then the forecasting, so the whole finance topic. Mr. Pears took this section, so I'll briefly run over a few things. So you need to know the need for finance. Now, a couple of reasons off the top of my head again is a firm might want to expand. In this case, it might want to bring production back to the UK from China, and that's going to have financial implications. You need to be aware of the cash flow implications. Is there going to be a cash shortage 1 month, and therefore the need for finance there? The business might find there's opportunities in the market to develop a certain type of product or to reach a new market, and if you don't have finance, you might miss out on those opportunities. You also need to be aware of whether finance is available. For example, banks at the moment are starting to lend that little bit more than they maybe were in 2008 during the credit crunch. PLC, as this company is, probably have access to finance more readily than the smaller company, so they can get their hands on things and exploit these opportunities. Again, obviously you need to be aware of loads of different types of finance. I'm just going to fly through a few. This is not an exhaustive list, but the owners might be able to invest some of their own funds. If there's evidence to suggest that the company is a success, then there might be some retained profit. Will the bank be able to offer them loans, which is more of a medium-term finance? A mortgage, which is a long-term source of finance. External finance, you need to be aware of internal and external. In this particular case study, it mentions grants. So are the government might offer grants to encourage a large business to locate in the area, because it will reduce unemployment and therefore raise standard of living in the area. So they might offer incentives, maybe what's called tax breaks, so they pay less tax. Sometimes they're called RDAs, so regional development agencies. Also in the case study, it mentions about machinery. Now there's options there. Do they use hire purchase, where you would pay for it in instalments and actually own the asset at the end of the payment period? Or would you use leasing, where you do the same monthly payments, but you don't end up with owning the asset? Now, if the asset is something that goes out of date, i.e. a computer, then you don't want to hire purchase it, because you then own a computer that's 10 years old and the software is dead, etc. However, some of the machinery to sew the cushions together, the technology might not move forward that quickly, and therefore hire purchase could be an option. Being a PLC, this company will be able to sell shares and has sold shares on the stock exchange. Must know the difference between LTD and PLC in terms of selling shares to people. Hang on, my wife's just trying to tell me to do something. Probably cook some tea. I'll be back in a second. I'm sure you'll be fascinated to know, but the question my wife was asking me is, do I want new potatoes or do I want sweet potato wedges? I went for new potatoes. It's a no-brainer. Right, moving on. You need to, I think I've mentioned already about short-term and long-term finance. You need to be aware of that, internal and external. You need to know what the purpose of the finance is before you select a particular method, and the business type, so we know it's a PLC. Cash flow is a massive section in section 5, huge amount of that in the case study. So you need to be able to analyse that cash flow forecast and talk about the problems, and we'll see that maybe an overdraft is appropriate because the cash flow is getting worse in terms of closing balance each month. It's used as a decision-making tool. However, there are problems with that. At the end of the day, it is just a forecast, and we all know that forecasts, although it might be based on previous year's figures to give them a better idea, it is still a prediction. However, cash flow is one of the most important documents, certainly for small businesses, because a lack of cash is often the reason why businesses fail. They often have orders and they've often got payments coming in, but those payments might come too late, and therefore cash flow is a vital document, especially if there's seasonal differences in sales, where there might be peaks, maybe just before, in this case I think it says Christmas, as they're getting the house ready, houses ready. Further analysis of sort of revenues and costs and profit data, you have to accept that, or you have to be able to talk about the risk versus reward. Well, yes, it's a risk moving the factory back to the UK. However, is the reward, and you should be able to analyse whether there is a reward there in terms of higher profits, higher customer satisfaction, more brand awareness, growth, maybe reducing the unit costs, maybe offering a higher selling price because it's made in the UK, which is often quite a nice way to advertise as a high-end, high-quality business. So that's that section. I'll move on to section 3 in a second. Right, last section is the external environment section. You can see 6 through 9 in terms of the topics. First thing we're going to look at very briefly is competitive environment. So you need to be aware of moving from perfect competition through to a monopoly and the effect that has on consumer choice, the effect that has on the price we pay as customers, the effect that perfect competition would have on how efficient companies have to be, because in a monopoly there's only one company, so they can charge as much as they want. They don't really have to be efficient, and therefore the government actually encourages more competition because we get a better deal as consumers. They would also like it because they get more tax revenue from the more companies that are in that environment. We don't get exploited if there's perfect competition, whereas in a monopoly we would do as consumers, and therefore the government often blocks companies when they try and buy other companies to form what they see as a monopoly. Right, number 7, I'm going to look at, well, clearly the environment issues, especially in the UK. We like to protect the green belt. The green belt is an area of land that often surrounds a city, and you're not allowed to build in that area. Quite often they try and get you to build on what's called brownfield sites where there's previously been a development or industry. They try and maintain some of the rural countryside for wildlife purposes, etc. There's growing pressure from campaign groups to do that. I think one thing that you need to be ready to do is carry out a cost versus benefit analysis of them moving back production back to the hometown, and you need to be able to look at all different stakeholders. So the costs, remember, aren't just financial costs. It's cost to the environment, it's cost to wildlife, pollution, etc. And the benefits might be things like jobs, so reducing unemployment, greater tax revenue for the government. It might be higher profits for the company. So you must be able to carry out a cost versus benefit of moving production back to the UK. I think it could be one of the longer answer questions, so I would definitely be prepared for a discussion at looking at both sides and then making a decision. I would go for moving it back, or I would say leaving it in China would have been a better choice. You have to be able to decide. This case study looks as if it's going to want you to cover sustainability. So are they using materials that are sustainable, which means they're good for the environment because you can replant the trees or whatever that you're using to create the fibres, to create the cushions. That's a good PR stunt. It looks good, and companies often have to do this. Whatever they take out of the earth, they often have to put back in. Something else that's along the same lines is fair trade, which is making sure that the producers, often in these third world countries, get a fair price for what they produce. I think it mentions Sierra Leone in the case study, one of the poorest countries in the world. Using fair trade is a good PR stunt. People like it, and it will justify the higher price. There's no way you'd be able to get away with £88 if it was made in China. People often want to see that it's made in somewhere where people are getting something back for their efforts, and the conditions that workers are working in are a bit more positive than the slave labour conditions that you might expect in some of these countries. So it's all really an ethics issue, because it is linked in with China, and in the past China has had problems with how it treats its staff and the low pay. That's originally why this company went out there. And there's an ethical issue in bringing production back to the UK because it's helping out UK unemployment and trying to tackle that. So this is where we move into topic number 8. So these last two are quite chunky ones. You've got to look at in number 8 it's things like government spending and taxation. So when government decide to spend, they invest in industry, they invest in maybe road building or bringing manufacturing back to the UK. So this particular company might benefit from that. If they increase taxes, then that might be something that puts off the factory owners moving back to the UK, because they might have to pay more corporation tax. Also, if the government increase tax on the consumer, then they have less disposable income, so they're maybe not going to buy those luxury items like cushions, etc. So what the government does has an impact on business, but also on the consumer. You need to be able to talk about interest rates. We've talked extensively, and we've done loads of work on how the Bank of England set what's called the base rate. Whatever the base rate is, which is 0.5 at the moment, that has a knock-on effect because the commercial banks, HSBC, etc., then offer loans at quite a cheap rate, and that means businesses and people can get access to finance easier, and it encourages their spending. For example, in the case study, it talks about unemployment, it talks about, I think, consumer confidence. If that's low, then people are not going to buy the items that this particular business has on offer. So unemployment is a major factor here, or employment. The more people that have got jobs, then the better this type of company will do, and there's more likelihood that they'll be profitable. The last section the specification wants to look at is population and the effect that has on businesses. Now, the higher the population, you've got more workers who might be prepared to offer their services, their labour at a cheaper cost. However, in the UK, we do obviously have the minimum wage, and the living wage is something that the businesses sign up for, or some of them do. So that has to be a factor that you're aware of. Not sure whether it has a huge impact on this particular case study. Right, if you've managed to stick with this right through to the end, well done. You probably had to do it in sections. We're going on to number 9, which is globalisation. So globalisation is effectively that the world is shrinking, clearly not physically, but in terms of the amount we trade with the EU, the amount we trade with America. There's companies that have head offices and manufacturing bases all over the world. Technology has allowed globalization to really move forward over the last 20 or so years, and this company actually have a bit of a global distribution and manufacturing network that you need to be able to talk about. So UK business and the EU, you need to be aware of what the EU is, the benefits and the drawbacks of being in the EU, the fact that there is free movement of labour. There's a lot of trading partners, so whatever we produce in this country, you might not have to pay as much import and export tax to get the goods in and out of different countries. We've also got quite a special relationship with America, so they're a strong trading partner with the UK as well. So you need to be up on that type of theory. And the last little bit that I want to skim over is how UK businesses do trade with other countries. Well, it's often largely to do with the exchange rate. So remember, you're spiced, so strong pounds, imports cheap, exports dear. You must be able to talk about that, and how the change in the value of the pound against other currencies has a direct impact on this particular company if they're trading or selling selling to consumers in different countries, or in fact importing raw materials to manufacture the product itself. Right, this is not every piece of theory that you will need for the exam. I have to stress that. It was supposed to be just a quick video to go through some of the highs and the lows of the business 50% exam that you will have in the next few months. Hopefully it's given you a few ideas of further revision that you can do. Cheers.